I was a young analytic candidate in the early 1980s when I had my first encounter with sexual boundary violations. A good friend in analysis with a respected male analyst, 20 years her senior, confided that he had been making explicit sexual advances toward her. She shut them down, but continued with him in treatment, remaining silent both with him and about him. If she had been traumatized by this experience, she kept it to herself. Her matter-of-fact silence confused me. I wasn't able to assimilate, no matter articulate, how I felt about all this. Instead, I filed it away and held it in a space apart. This was, I thought, most likely a single incident in the career of a widely esteemed analyst. What would be gained by creating trouble for someone to whom so many were devoted? There seemed to be no way to hold his talent in tension with his transgressions, and I sidelined the latter. It turned out that my friend had been far from alone in her experience. Rumors, some vague, others quite specific, began to surface, communicated in whispers intermingled with both horror and prurient pleasure. My friend's analyst and another senior person had breached sexual boundaries with both supervisees and patients. Decades later, we have come to know that these were neither rumors nor isolated occurrences. Nearly all of us have been privy to gossip and fact about boundary violations within and outside our particular analytic communities. Yet only a tiny number of these violations have come under public scrutiny. Even when they do, they're almost never openly discussed, no matter made public in wider forums. Most often, the event is treated more like a lurid story than a phenomenon requiring serious exploration. Psychoanalytic theories have their origins in ideas about sexuality's psychic elements, so how ironic and how unsurprising that we've enacted incestuous boundary crossings since our professional beginnings. While there's a large literature on the dynamics of the violator and the victim, of course by Glenn, Pizer, Sandler, Godley, Salenza, Dimon, and others, far less has been written about the communal side of this phenomenon. What does happen, psychologically speaking, to those of us who are not directly involved? What do we do with and about what we know? We psychoanalysts may represent a clinical, theoretical Tower of Babel, but one thing binds us together. Despite our commitment to protecting our patients, analysts have been engaging in sexual boundary violations since this field's beginnings. These violations and their perpetrators are ghosts that haunt us within and, of course, outside the psychoanalytic world. I call them ghosts rather than ancestors because their impact is at once insidious, unnameable, and profound. These ghosts hover unmetabolized at the edge of our communities, coloring our feelings about our profession, institute, and colleagues. Periodically popping into the clinical encounter, the shadow of the violator becomes a deeply disturbing not me element. It's not surprising that sexual boundary violations tend to recur across analytic generations. Their victims are especially vulnerable to reenacting in reverse the trauma they experienced. Too often, we fail both to reach out to the victim and to take action on her behalf. Too often, she is left feeling abandoned, shamed, or blamed, alone to metabolize the experience. But our communal failure doesn't reflect collective indifference. If anything, it's our near inability to encompass sexual breaches that renders us passive. We don't know what to say, whom to tell, or what to do. The fact that sexual breaches are frequently committed by those in a position of professional power only exacerbates our conundrum. The violator has gravitas. He's often a psychoanalytic great, someone we idealize. His behavior shakes up, even dismantles our professional ideal. Yet our need to idealize him also pulls us to rationalize, as Glenn described, to obfuscate what we need not to see and not to know. Perhaps his therapeutic brilliance allowed him to breach boundaries without compromising his healing capacity. Wasn't he acting in the best interest of the patient most of the time? Will we abandon our own sense of ethical agency and become collaborators, passive, complicit participants in something we abhor? This is idealization's malignant underbelly. Yet our idealizations aren't something we can altogether do without. We need to believe in our mentors and in the field of psychoanalysis as a whole. We want and need to believe in the field's curative power. Steadying us in the face of clinical uncertainty, our ideals inspire us. They give us something against which to model and evaluate ourselves. They remind us of the importance of professional ethics and integrity, self-reflectivity, the honesty of the field as a whole. In some respects, our ideals represent a wedge against the kinds of delinquencies I've talked about elsewhere, against what Erwin Hirsch calls coasting in the countertransference. They ought to serve as a barrier to sexual and non-sexual boundary violations, but they usually don't. Too often, the space between our ideals and actuality silences us. It invites compartmentalization and denial as we disavow the actual. It's not possible that he had sex with the patient. These are real quotes, by the way. It's a nasty rumor perpetrated by those who envy him. It was a single incident, not such a big deal. At other times, we find more complex ways of rationalizing. Sometimes people really fall in love, or even shocking in its cynicism and or naivete. Come on, it's not as if he raped her. When evidence of harm makes these kinds of rationalizations impossible, for example, when the analyst is decades older than the patient, or when the patient falls apart or presses charges, we may move disavowal in a different direction. We maintain our idealization by blaming, pathologizing really, the victim while emphasizing the analyst's innocence and benign intentions. The patient is unbelievably seductive. I bet she hallucinated it, turned his kindly touch into a sexual moment. Despite the denial embedded in this kind of idealization and an implicit denigration of the patient, there's often also a bit of truth. Patient victims often bring their own abuse history into the treatment relationship, and those dynamics contribute to its sexual denouement. Adding to our emotional confusion is the fact that analysts who breach professional boundaries are not necessarily guilty of cold, calculated abuse. Many are not psychopaths, and most aren't entirely defined by their action. They may be brilliant writers and or may do sensitive therapeutic work with other patients. We analysts, ourselves vulnerable to fantasy, sometimes lose track of our need for intimacy, rescue, idealized love. As Gabbard reminds us, sexual violations are typically the end point in a slow slide down a slippery slope with a particular patient, not with all patients. Should we utterly blacken the name and destroy the reputation of someone who also resides outside the realm of analytic failure? Our need to protect the violator's stature also reverberates at a more abstract level. What if telling damages our community's place in the wider psychoanalytic world? What if we disrupt, even dismantle, the experience of those analysans, supervisees, and students who were in fact helped by the analyst? In declaring that the emperor has no clothes, will we take down our kingdom? And what about us? What if the violator or his supporters retaliate? We are silent because we're scared. We may even come to doubt what we know. Legal constraints can coalesce with all these anxieties and shut us down. Suspecting, even knowing via hearsay, precludes legal action. Both the whistleblower and the institute are vulnerable to libel suits. Those in positions of administrative power are silenced by their own legal counsel. Scared, impotent, we become doubtful. Are we sure? After all, we weren't there. What if we're wrong? When reality becomes undeniable and we're confronted with what we can't exclude, our idealization shatters, replaced by bitter disillusionment. He's a sleazeball. He's losing it. He thinks with his dick. We effectively excommunicate the analyst, eject him from our psychic and literal midst. In part, we do this because the analyst behavior has, in fact, been reprehensible and deserving of ostracism. But I think there's another dynamic at work as well. As we denigrate him, we simultaneously find a way to protect our idealization by relocating it elsewhere. He's not a real analyst. He's no hero of mine. X, on the other hand, would never behave this way. It's he I emulate. Those who commit boundary violations sometimes justify their actions by invoking a clinical theory that seems to justify alterations of the ordinary analytic frame. The patient's vulnerability and need, sexual or emotional inhibition require it. I'm going to skip this because Glenn just described it. But rather than sort of locating this kind of thing in a Winnicottian reparative model, it seems to me that any kind of clinical model can be justified in this way as the basis for a boundary violation. Here are two dramatic instances in which other clinical theories were used to justify boundary violations. A young woman's Freudian analyst regularly masturbated her to orgasm in the name of, quote, activating her dead libido. His theoretical investment in the power of the drives was used perversely as a rationalization for sexual acting out. This analyst's grandiosity, supported by his stature in his community, protected him from scrutiny, no matter from censure. Another patient, in an analysis with an interpersonalist, described how his analyst took her to lunch on many occasions, after which he kissed and fondled her. The analyst believed that free social interaction would help his self-deprecating patient feel better about herself and awaken her sexual longings. The patient was aware of feeling self-conscious, yet also pleased about the special place she had in her analyst's life. Only years later did she come to recognize how traumatizing these experiences had been. Although no analytic theory justifies boundary violations, no theory entirely protects us from their pull. If there is any protection against this slide, it lies, I think, in community, in our willingness to see and name these breaches collectively. Yet it's the rare psychoanalytic community that has effectively addressed this issue with its members. While violators are sometimes forced to leave their institute, most often they reestablish themselves elsewhere. Their leave-takings tend to be kept quiet. The larger community may buzz with gossip, but facts are scarce. Ultimately, the transgressive element becomes part of our professional legacy, lodged in a kind of psychoanalytic, professional, collective unconscious. At one of my institutes, we continue not to name a beloved mentor, now long deceased, who is widely known to have committed sexual boundary violations. We admire his vision and his writing. We don't know how to reconcile his brilliance with his misbehavior. It's yet more impossible for us to name violators who are still alive and working among us. And so, when recent boundary violations came to light, intense gossip and public silence dominated. In part, this was because the administration is legally constrained. But unavoidable though these constraints may be, they mystify, indeed they gaslight, the wider professional community, and most particularly, as Seth also talked about, candidates in training. Whispered gossip is so often our only release. We find an other or a few others with whom to share what we know. But rather than serving as an emotional envelope within which to contain, process, and work through disturbing feelings, gossip intensifies our distress. It leaves us disrupted rather than relieved. It provides no opportunity for emotional exploration or working through. Gossip takes place almost exclusively between friends or in small groups. Larger groups usually preclude this kind of exchange. Indeed, when two sexual violations, one old and one current, came up in a class of 10 I teach, both were energetically discussed while everyone, myself included, avoided naming the faculty members. Several people declared that it would be libelous to do so, even though we all knew whom we were talking about and that these were facts, not rumors. The conversation turned instead to a transgressor from a different institute in a different city whose story had been publicized in the press. It's safe to name him. He's other, neither personally beloved, idealized, nor powerful in our institute. Our silence may appear to protect our community, but it doesn't. If anything, it supports a kind of group illusion-delusion that makes it near impossible for us as individuals and as institutions to contain or metabolize violations without doing major damage to our professional self-image and group identity, to our family. And paradoxically, even as I try to surface this dynamic here, I simultaneously enact it. I describe really disturbing events, but don't name the institutes I'm referring to or the violators I'm speaking about. Do I mystify more than I clarify? Do I arouse curiosity and anxiety, thereby perpetuating the problem even as I try to unpack it? Do I inadvertently create yet more silent witnesses? I'm tempted to name a name to actively break into this collusion. It would have to be a name that's safe, the name of someone deceased or already identified in the press, someone who couldn't sue me or my institute. On one level, naming the elephant in the room would be relieving. But on another level, it would be anything but. Identifying the perpetrator could have a destructive impact on his former patients, those he didn't abuse, his colleagues, and his students. What would be gained in any case by naming someone who's no longer a danger? It's those I can't name who remain the danger. It's the perpetrators who are alive and well and active that I'm really worried about. And even here, naming names is problematic. In the process of naming some, I'd be leaving others out, creating some scapegoats while inadvertently protecting other transgressors. There seems to be no exit. There's something else to consider. How will you, the listener, experience all this? What if you yourself were victim or witness to a sexual boundary violation? What if I break into your denial? If it's your analyst, colleague, or friend who was or is a violator or victim? Will you feel anger at the violator for breaching your trust? Exposure as your secret is partially unmasked? Guilt because you remain silent about it? Shame over not reporting your abuse or the abuse you witnessed? Jealousy and hurt over not having been chosen as a special patient or confidant? And if you were or are only a witness, how upset are you entitled to feel? After all, it didn't happen to you. While first working on this paper, I naively assumed that I'd be addressing a group of bystanders and witnesses. Only later did it dawn on me that some of you might have been or be currently committing a boundary violation. Will this paper open up reflective space, making room for you to own what you did or are doing? Or will it alienate you, leaving you more defensive and closed down than ever? To further complicate things, I'm not sure that a large group setting can contain the feelings that this kind of material evokes. Large groups provide neither a sense of cohesion nor emotional safety. We need to limit how much we expose ourselves in them. Is it surprising that we deal with what can't be encompassed by disavowing it? Disavowal is a formidable defense, one that reflects the magnitude of the traumatic disturbance it sidelines. And I know this from the inside because I encountered my own disavowal while writing this paper. It's a story I never forgot, but it's one that was lodged in a space so utterly covered over that it didn't dawn on me that it was related to this paper till I finished writing it. About 25 years after I finished my first analysis, I learned that my former analyst had left her husband for a patient. My ex-analyst and I were still in touch, and I rather naively tried to communicate my distress to her. Unsurprisingly, she didn't welcome this conversation and became extremely angry and defensive. The interaction was difficult and disappointing, but it was what happened next that represented the boundary breach. A few days later, I received a very hostile phone message from my ex-analyst partner, whom I did not know. In it, she made clear that she knew quite a lot about me and used that knowledge to attack me personally. Her viciousness left me shaking actually. Clearly, my ex-analyst had shared personal information about me with her partner. Her partner's retaliatory, threatening phone call evoked a mixture of hurt, outrage, and vulnerability as I tried to digest the fact that my analyst had betrayed my trust. Probably because this treatment relationship was decades old, and I had come to see my former analyst in a shaded rather than an idealized way, I was less upset with her than I might have been. Still, it's astonishing to me that, until I finished writing this paper, I hadn't realized that a second boundary violation had been committed against me. My analyst betrayed her patient lover first, but she also betrayed her other patients and ex-patients, including me. She upended my professional ideal twice by breaching sexual boundaries with her own patient and then failing to honor the privileged nature of our relationship. I had managed to sideline the fact that I had been both witness and victim. How difficult to metabolize even 30 years out. Former patients who learn of but are not the victim of boundary violations are perhaps in the position similar to that of a non-abused child whose sibling is being abused. While she often has no emotional choice except to keep the secret, the peripheral traumatic element is assimilated on a procedural level where it festers and disturbs. At times, a socio-political residue informs our silence. It's the horror of being informants, grown-up tattletales. Finger-pointing sullies us. We cringe at its implications. Indeed, many of us are identified with the position of the other and with the ethical autonomy inherent in that stance. Perhaps our reluctance is in part reflective of the traumatic shadow of the McCarthy era. But whether or not we were red diaper babies, in one way or another, I think we resist becoming informants. And then there are more personal sources of conflict about speaking up. Does our anxiety, often unconscious, about our own badness and destructiveness make whistleblowing feel like an act of aggression or duplicity rather than one done on behalf of the victim? After all, who among us has never committed a boundary violation or enjoyed a sexual fantasy about a patient? Who has never harbored hostile fantasies about a colleague or worried about her negative impact on the other? To name a transgressor stimulates our own bad analyst feeling, associated anxiety and guilt about our misbehavior, however minor and whatever its particulars. Here's another complicating element. Despite the fact that psychoanalytic writing has long acknowledged the presence of erotics in the countertransference, our own sexual fantasies edge uncomfortably close to enactment when we contemplate the actuality of sexual boundary violations. While these violations disturb us, an element of sexual charge can coexist with that distress. Most of us have never engaged in sexual boundary crossings, but I bet that nearly all of us have had moments when we wished we could. The colleague who enacts the forbidden provides us with an opportunity to vicariously experience what's prohibited, all the while reinforcing our subjective sense of purity. Do we register a double response of horror and a kind of perverse titillation? Do we split, locating sexuality out there where it doesn't threaten our own good analyst feeling? I suspect that both shame and pleasure are embedded here, a response to trauma that melds with a more ordinary erotic excitement and leaves us feeling at once ashamed and affectively elevated. We gossip, allowing ourselves the charge of an erotically colored story while remaining above the fray. Is our gossip a kind of emotional masturbation, stimulating but lacking a climax or finality that would contain and settle things? Certainly this excitement is not uncomplicated. In part, it's informed, driven in fact, by underlying feelings of what Kuhn called erotic horror, grief, identification with the victim, anger, and a sense of powerlessness. But alongside all this, or perhaps in response to it, we find it tough to relinquish the perverse pleasure inherent in keeping and gossiping about these erotic secrets. It seems to me that at bottom, our very complex feelings about sexual boundary violations reflect our powerful, mostly unconscious need to retain an exalted analytic ideal. That ideal precludes doubleness and thus is vulnerable to shatter. If we are to move beyond this impasse, we need to encompass the possibility that truly reprehensible professional behavior can coexist with the capacity for good analytic work and/or intellectual brilliance. We need to find a way to create our own version of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There, the victims of unspeakable violence confronted their abusers. The possibility of genuine restorative justice was created when harm was fully acknowledged and, in some instances, amnesty from prosecution was given. So here's a wish fantasy, that we as psychoanalytic communities create a restorative justice system for both victims and perpetrators, that we begin to directly but privately approach our colleagues when we think they might have committed or might be committing boundary violations, that we do the same with those we suspect are victims. Can we imagine creating a protected space within which perpetrators could acknowledge what happened as a first step toward rehabilitation rather than punishment? Could we create a reflective rather than punitive atmosphere within which victim and perpetrator could speak to each other and acknowledge harm done? In which state law and local governing associations like the APA granted amnesty in cases where full disclosure, remorse, and reparation occurred? Can we even fathom such a process separate from legal action and banishment? To do this, we need to acknowledge what we know aloud and to speak together. This means accepting that some of our exalted analytic heroes were and are boundary violators, with the fact that we who would never breach a sexual boundary nevertheless commit small but disturbing analytic infractions. We psychoanalysts have got much to be proud of and much to be ashamed of. How ironic that we who embrace the clinical value of paradox and emotional complexity have such difficulty holding our ideals flexibly. We're too often pulled to negate the non-ideal because the threat of traumatic de-idealization is unbearable. If we are to confront our silence and its dynamics, if we are to address the experience of victims, perpetrators, and witnesses, and attempt any kind of repair, we need to speak together about what we know, feel, and are afraid to say. I very much doubt, and Glenn clearly seems to feel the same way, that we'll ever succeed in putting a full stop to sexual or non-sexual boundary violations. But we might find ways to address their impact on the professional community and our participation in them, were we less wedded to a rigid vision of the field and of ourselves. It's time, isn't it? Thank you.